Well, it's getting to that time of year when my mind starts turning towards tench fishing again, but unfortunately we're in lockdown in the UK at the moment, so can talk about it, but we can't actually do any at the moment. But if you enjoy these videos, please give us a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button below. I really appreciate it. So I thought today, as we can't get out and actually do any fishing, I'll talk a little bit about location and how that's affected by the time of year. Something that is absolutely critical to all types of fishing, you know, so much more important than the rigs and baits that you use, but often something that we overlook. And it does, I think, vary quite a bit from the time of year, especially with species like tench. Now, traditionally, and when I started sort of seriously tench fishing, we still had a closed season here in the UK. And that meant my fishing started around the middle of June and was often finished by the middle of July because the lakes got really weedy and it became impossible to fish. And so the fishing was really confined to a short period of time when the tench were, you know, fairly predictable really. They'd be fairly active. It would be coming up to spawning time, probably towards the end of that period. And often the fishing would be limited by how weedy the pits got. And then eventually the lake that I used to fish in particular would become so weedy that it wasn't fair on the fish to fish for. And so I'd pull off because you'd end up losing more fish in the weed than you would land. Obviously today things are very different and we can fish for tench on many still waters right through the year, and that has opened up different aspects. I mean, I guess I've never kept records really, but I guess I've probably caught tench in every month of the year, even right through the winter, which, you know, debunks the theory that they're really a summer species. But obviously when the water temperatures are higher, your results are going to be a lot better. Now, some strange things that I've picked up on over the years. One is that very often there's a short period, maybe only a couple of days in February, when for some reason the tench go on the feed, and you'll see reports of big fish being caught up and down the country, or nets of fish in matches on places like the Raveley Drain in Cambridgeshire. You know, as a tremendous form for weights of tench in that February window. And exactly why that is, what wakes the tench up just for those few days and get some feed in, I really don't know. I mean, I'd hazard a guess that it's perhaps a combination of day length and maybe just hunger as well. And, you know, for a few days they'll have a feed and then, you know, become almost uncatchable again for a few weeks. Now, a good friend of mine once pointed out that he starts his tench fishing when the hawthorn bushes start to bud and the buds open and start to produce some flowers. And that's pretty good advice really, especially if you live in the south of England. Can still be a bit touch and go at that time of year. Very often tactics tend to be single small baits like 10mm pop-ups and stuff like that. Really high vis baits that are going to pick fish up, and generally I find that they're male tench rather than female ones that are active that early in the season. And yeah, I've watched those fish in clear gravel pits and they're often moving around quite quickly, a few feet off the bottom, and a bright bait just seems to catch their attention and often they'll get caught. And once again, if you check out social media, you often see that a lot of carp anglers who are fishing small pop-ups on chod rigs that time of year will start catching a lot of tench and often some very big tench. So if it's working for those guys, why not adopt those tactics into your own fishing? Obviously scale down a little bit, size-wise, hook size and line strength size compared to what you'd need for carp. But definitely there's a few weeks, and we're probably talking about April, it's being the key period when this kind of tactics tends to work in the UK. But once we get beyond that period and we get into the tench fishing seriously, which for me, I'm always really torn because I love my bream fishing and often I'll start bream fishing before the tench because they tend to come on when the water temperature is a little bit lower. And really I want to keep my bream fishing going until probably the end of May. That's when they tend to spawn and I'll stop fishing for them. But that's a critical period, and so I'm always torn because I really want to start my tench fishing in May, especially again down in the southern counties. So it's always, you know, a juggling act really, which one do I fish for, and often it depends on how well the bream fishing's going. If I'm catching, I'll stick with it for a few more weeks, or if it's been tough, I'll maybe swap over and fish for the tench. But my tench fishing Or my serious tench fishing, if I'm looking to put a campaign on the lake, generally starts actually the year before, specifically in the depths of winter. And if I can, if I've got a ticket for a lake, that's when I'll go and do a lot of the preparation work, a lot of the plumbing. I'll use a traditional marker float. I might use a Water Wolf underwater camera to look at some of the features and what the bottom's made of. I might use a deeper just to go round and get a quick idea of the depths and the variation. But it's so much easier to do that work, A, when you're not lugging around a mountain of gear with you, fishing gear, and B, when there's no weed around, or the weeds sort of died back as much as possible, because then you're not constrained by picking up loads of weed on your marker float all the time and really struggling. So if you can, days spent on the water at that time of year, and generally this is when everything else is pretty slow, end of January, beginning of February, I'll get down there and have a day or two and just spend the whole day, won't take any fishing gear, just getting to know a venue as well as I can. And one tip that I can give you is the problem with marker floats is, and we all tend to do it, you get them and you cast them out as far as you can towards your eyes and drag them back, feeling for features. Fine. You'll find gravel bars and differences in the bottom composition and stuff like that. But a critical thing, especially with tench, is to use a marker float in the margins, both because I want to know where the bottom of the drop-off is, what it's made up of, but also you'll often find in gravel pits that there's variations in the slope along the bank of the drop-off. And very often I'm looking for the spots where the drop-off is quite distinct and then onto a relatively flat bottom fairly close in. All that information builds up and it can give you an idea, even within a swim where you think a couple of foot in the margin can't make that big a difference. But if you can find those spots, all much the better. The steeper bits where the steeper drop-offs is what I'm looking for. Very often the same applies on gravel bars as well. Look for steep-sided gravel bars, the steep parts, and critically look for areas where perhaps the bottom or the top of the bar drops a little bit and becomes a bit deeper. Often there's spots where fish will move over them, or again they can signal that there's a change in the slope of the bar, and that can hold fish and be the real hot spots within a swim. So all that work's done. I've probably made some notes, drawn up some diagrams of the swims, and so by the time I get down there and the weed's starting to come up and I really want to get fishing, and probably the lake's going to be busy, probably more often than not with carp anglers more than tench anglers, but I'm not having to spend hours and hours flogging a swim to death with a marker float whilst I'm actually fishing in May. And the fishing that time of year, the fish are going to be quite active and feeding up really in the pre-spawning time. And so it's very simple tactics for me generally. If there's not too many small fish about, I'll generally use maggots or casters, a little bit of hemp, a little bit of krill feed in there, the real krill, frozen stuff I'll put in, and not huge amounts of bait either. I mean, it could be half a pint per rod per day, something like that, mixed feed. I don't think you need to really fill it in. A lot of the time those fish are patrolling and you'll actually watch them roll and you can follow the fish as they move through the swim very often, and you don't need a lot of bait in there. Get a bite over a little bit of bait, top it up. I'm often using a fairly big swim feeder full of maggots or casters anyway. Top it up and you're ready to go. Now I mentioned fish rolling, tench rolling, and again there's a few theories that I've got and things that I've picked up on over the years. Now I love getting up early in the morning when the mist's just rolling off the lake and the light levels are coming up, and so often the tench will be there rolling. Doesn't mean you might catch them that time of day. You might catch them much later, especially on gravel pits. You can catch them right through the day. But being able to get up, watch them while the rest of the world is asleep can teach you so much. Now, you'll find that tench roll in different ways. Often you'll see them and the tail slap on the surface. Now, my theory, and it is only a theory, is that they tend to be the smaller malefish that do that. Don't know why that should be, but when I've watched them really closely, they're relatively small fish often, and I'm sure they're the males. When I've seen them right on the edge doing it in clear water, that's the impression that I've got. Now, the rolls that I really like are the oily ones where the tench come up and there's no sound at all generally, and you'll just see a fish break surface, and then down again. And if you're not looking closely, you'd never know. It's not like a carp coming out of the water and spladoshing back down. If you're not paying attention, you won't see those fish at all. And often, like I say, you'll see them and there'll be a fish over there and then they'll move across a swim. And often, sometimes, you can even tell by the shape of the roll, I'm sure, that it's the same fish that's moving across a swim, moving around. And it can give you a bit of a false perspective, really, of actually how many fish are there. But interesting to watch those patrol routes. Now, coming back to features and rolling, a lesson I learned a long time ago is that I tend to target specific features in the swim rather than the open water if it's possible. That could well be the margin. Very often it'll be the margin, or it could be edge of an island or gravel bar or a change in bottom composition. Anything where there's something that the fish can use as a patrol route. And, you know, it's just like if you were walking through a park, 90% of the people that you see in that park will be walking along the footpath. 10%, 5% might be walking across the grass. But most people, and it's exactly the same with the fish, will follow patrol routes where there's a defined something on the bottom that gives them an idea, a marker of where they're going. And so they're the 10 areas I tend to fish to. Like I say, years ago I learned that fish rolling in open water, especially if you've got a lot of weed and you're forced to fish in the open spots, which are pretty much random, you don't know why the open spots are there, it can be really, really tough, and your actual number of bites will be really low in comparison to if you can target those areas. And generally what I'll do, if it's a gravel bar or the margin, I'm looking to fish within probably 4 or 5 feet at the bottom of the drop-off. No further than that. That tends to be an area which gets a bit of backwash, so it's probably not quite as weedy, and it's probably a bit more gravelly and a little bit less deep silt than it'll be further out. So it's quite a nice area to present a bait. Margins, again, great because you can prep swims and use a rake. If you're serious about your tench fishing, then one tool that you really need to get yourself is a weed rake. It will make such a difference to your fishing. Not just because it allows you to open up and remove spots in the weed where you can fish, but also because it means you can get your line lay a lot better and back lead down if needs be, and keep the line down rather than it being strung up on bits of weed. And even one strand of weed can hold your line up, can even hold leg core up. You know, so I like to prep the swims in the margin and get as, not open a big space up, but the spaces that I do open up, which are probably no more than 3 or 4 foot wide, as clean as possible. And you can do that with a throwing rake, but I'm, to be honest, rubbish with a throwing rake. It goes all over the place. Was never any good at cricket when I was a kid. Could never throw a ball straight, and I can't throw a rake straight. So a few years ago, I invested in an aspen rake, which is on poles. And it's a brilliant piece of kit, very expensive to be honest, but again, it allows you so much more accuracy with how you can rake a swim. It's absolutely brilliant. It allows you to clear everything out and get the line laid perfect, you know, which is so important for those margin swims. If you're fishing further out, then once the weed starts coming up, you've got to take what you're given really and fish the spots you can. And that can be on the fish or off the fish. Once again, generally speaking, gravel bars will stay relatively clear the longest because of the amount of turbulence created when there's a strong wind blowing, help disperse the weed. And if they're really shallow bars, even the bird life and the swans will help keep them clear. So again, you are very often, once you get into June and July, you're going to be limited on the spots you can fish. And it's just a matter of doing the best you possibly can. As well as rolling, another thing that's worth looking out for is bubbling. But I find this is much less important than it is with other species like carp. The bubbles that I'm looking for are generally very, very fine ones. And again, it comes down to years of experience of watching the water, watching where tench are rolling and then bubbling and seeing what type of bubbles you get. You can get some coloured water and you can get bigger bubbles if they're releasing gas from the bottom, but generally that's over quite a soft anoxic kind of mud, not the best places to fish a lot of the time. So some lakes you get quite a lot of bubbling, others it's very, very rare, but the fine bubbles Almost like pinhead side stuff is what you're really looking for. But often, just because you don't see them as much, it's not as good a sign as actually seeing rolling fish. And tench on most venues really love to roll, and you'll gain a lot of information about where to fish by watching them rolling. My tench fishing tends to end when the weed starts coming up and the fish spawn. And I always tend to leave fish alone, when they're spawning, and give them a few months to recover. So normally, I'll finish my tench fishing down south in sort of Kent and Berkshire and counties like that. Normally, probably around the beginning, mid-June. I'll then maybe move up into the Midlands, into Cambridgeshire for a few weeks, because the fish there tend to spawn a bit later. But certainly by the end of June, beginning of July, that's it, over for another year. So again, it's a relatively short window, but a really, really enjoyable one, and one that I put a lot of effort into. And it really is. I mean, I live in Worcestershire, which apparently is officially the worst county in the country for tench. So I have to put the effort in and travel if I want big fish, but it really is worth the effort when one rolls into the net. They absolutely are superb fish. And relatively easy to catch with some simple tactics, really. So hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you want to learn more about the tactics and the baits that I used, then have a look at some of the other videos on my channel, because we've covered it quite a lot in the past. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.